this? What a ghastly crew! Just joking. I must say, your teacher, Mr. Ruhl, could not be here today. And he asked me if I would come and be your substitute teacher. And it is my pleasure to be here with you today because I've got so many stories to tell you. You must know that Mr. Ruhl loves you dearly and hated to be gone today. But he's on holiday. He asked me if I would substitute. Now, I am finding your world to be very strange indeed. I thought I was dying. I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And I asked Mr. Ruhl when I met him if he was St. Peter. He said no. But he did say, this is not heaven. This is Indiana. And I said, what happened? He said, Charles, oh, how rude of me. I'm Charles Darwin. And it's a pleasure to meet you. But he said to me, it was a time machine that brought you here. A time machine invented by the Purdue University Physics Department. A time machine. He also told me that, what, you've never seen an old man before? He also told me that when I go back to 1870, I won't remember any of this. Good God, I said. I won't remember any of this? He said, no. He has taught me, Mr. Ruhl, your teacher, has taught me so much in the last 48 hours about genes, inheritance, DNA. And he said all the work that's going on in DNA research today is verifying my theories. Who would have thought? I didn't think. I was just enjoying studying natural history. But he did say I won't remember any of this when I go back to England, back to 1870. Sadly, I won't remember any of you. But I will try not to cry. I'll try. So, what would you like to know? Do you have any questions that you would like to ask me first? You look like you're in shock. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes.
Oh, hello, what's this? Visitors.
Lots of guests.
Welcome. I thought I was in heaven, and Mr. Ruhl told me, no, this is Indiana. Actually, my wife, Emma. Do you know my wife, Emma? She would have been happy to know I had ended up in heaven. She would not have been happy to think that I had died. That's not what I meant. She would have been happy to know I ended up in heaven because my dear wife, Emma, bless her soul, is quite concerned about me. And I'm worried because she is worried about me. Do you know what she worries about me? She worries that if I publish my book, The Origin of Species, which I've already done, it's 1870, right? Oh no, it's the 21st century. I forgot. When I go back home, it will be 1870 again. My wife, Emma, said, Charles, if you publish that book, The Origin of Species, I fear for your eternal soul. And she said, what vexes me most is to know that if you publish that book, that you and I will be separated from each other for eternity. And that's something I can't bear. I told Emma, I said, Emma, my dear, dear Emma, I really don't think species forming by natural selection under the control of natural laws, I really don't think that's any more theologically threatening than the idea that the planets revolve around the sun, or the apparent motion of the sun across the sky. I really don't think it's any more theologically threatening than those scientific concepts. She's still worried, and I worry about her. I told her, Emma, God, if he exists, must be the cause of causes. So, a scientific explanation for the origin of living things doesn't take God, if he exists, out of the picture. She's still concerned. And you need to know that's exactly why. That's the main reason why it took me so long to publish. Concern for Emma's feelings. But I published. I think she forgave me. I think she's carrying on. But enough of my family business. Would you like to see some pictures? And some... And Mr. Ruhl taught me how to use this contraption here, called a PowerPoint. Magic. It's magic to me. He taught me how to use this, so I could show you some pictures. Do you mind if I take off my frock coat? Getting a bit warm in here. Oh, the arthritis is catching up. Oh, goodness. Well, anyway, we'll start from the very beginning, shall we? I was born in Shrewsbury, England, February 12th, 1809. Now, it just so happens that is the exact day and year when your Abraham Lincoln was born. But Abraham Lincoln is a much greater man than I. I have always admired Lincoln's stance on abolition and his stance against slavery. Always admired that. I myself am an abolitionist, as was my father before me. Oh, tourists. Tourists sometimes travel to Shrewsbury. I don't understand tourists. But they go to my birthplace, those who are interested. Oh, goodness, a chair with wheels. How quaint. There's even a shopping center in Shrewsbury, England, named after me. Unbelievable what has happened. I need to tell you about my mother, Susanna. God rest her soul. She died when I was only 8 years old. Fortunately, my 3 older sisters showered me with motherly affection which made up for her absence. Helped a little bit, just a tad. Here's where I went to school in Shrewsbury, England. Grammar school. Oh, I hated school. It was boring. I would much rather have been outside, out of doors, collecting insects, naming them, labeling them, all sorts and sizes, collecting insects, collecting plants, pressing them, preserving them, collecting rocks and fossils and minerals. I loved natural history from the get-go. That's an expression Mr. Ruhl taught me. I was so not into my studies that my father, Robert Darwin, mortified me when he said, "You care for nothing," only he went like this. "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to your family and yourself." Is my beard coming off? Good. My father was the kindest man I knew, so he must have been in a foul mood when he said that. It must have been a bad day. Must have been. Oh, I almost forgot. Mr. Ruhl told me to tell you, take out a sheet of paper. Or use your surface. Whatever in God's name a surface is. Use your surface or a sheet of paper. And he told me to tell you, take notes, good notes, because you will be able to use these on an activity later. Do it. Do it. When I was your age, if we weren't paying attention, the teacher would rap our knuckles with a ruler. I won't do that. I've been told it's 2018. I won't do that. Promise. So eventually my father wanted me to go and train for the medical profession. He sent me to medical school in Cambridge University. Oh, I despised it. The lectures were boring. Watching surgery performed without anesthesia horrified me. I even retched. I could not handle it. In my spare time, I went out of doors. What do you think I did when I went out of doors?
Explored.
Pardon?
Like catch insects.
That's right. I caught insects, labeled them, named them, collected plants, rocks, fossils, minerals. That's where my true love was. At medical school, my brother Erasmus was there as well. We called him Ras. Ras. Do you know what my nickname was as a child? Gas. Because I loved doing chemistry experiments with Ras. And we made gas out of mixing chemicals together. Didn't know that, did you? Now you know. So there we were, me and Ross at medical school. Eventually, Father decided that I was not cut out for medicine. So he decided to send me to Christ's College at Cambridge. Oh, did I say I went to medical school at Cambridge? Sorry. The mind is not as sharp as it used to be. Medical school was Edinburgh. Goodness gracious! Edinburgh, how could I forget? He sent me to Cambridge, Christ College, to study for the clergy, to become a clergyman. Well, that didn't suit me either. So, I still continued my collecting, my study of natural history. To me, it was fun. I think someone for their life profession should pick something that is fun, because you'll be doing it for the rest of your life. Don't do what other people tell you you should do. Do what your heart tells you to do. Now, at Cambridge, I became friends with a good fellow, a mentor of mine. He actually became a friend and mentor, Professor John Stevens Henslow. He was a botanist. And so we hit it off jolly well. He was a botanist. He became my mentor at Cambridge. Eventually, in today's language, you would say I changed my major to natural history, natural and revealed history, and I eventually graduated from Cambridge, and since I found my niche at last, I graduated 10th out of 178 because I found the field that I loved. After graduation, I was 22 years old. I went back to my home, Shrewsbury. I went back to my home, and there on the desk was a letter from Professor Henslow. And inside that letter was another letter from a Professor George Peacock. He was an astronomer. And he said there was an opportunity awaiting me to serve as a naturalist on board a ship, Her Majesty's ship Beagle, which would sail around the world on a 5-year voyage to boldly go where no Englishman has gone before. 5-year voyage. On the Beagle, you see the captain of the Beagle, Captain Sir Robert Fitzroy, was looking for a gentleman naturalist to travel along on this trip. An educated man who he could have intelligent, stimulating conversation with at dinner time. Because for the most part, the sailors were rough, uneducated, a salty lot. And he wanted a gentleman companion that he could have good conversation with over dinner. I said, why not? My father did not think it was such a good idea. A waste of time, he said. I must have been somewhat rebellious at 22 because I went on that trip. What a wonderful experience. Except for the fact that all the time we were on water, I was seasick. 5 years of being seasick. It was ghastly. Raise your hand if you've ever been seasick. Now you know what it was like. Occasionally we would stop off at land and go and stay on land for a while. Then I felt much better. But we went all around the world. This is a photograph a reconstruction. We did not have cameras in 1831. Mr. Ruhl, I believe, took these photographs. A reconstruction of my cabin on board the Beagle. There I am, young and stout, poring over specimens and notes. Sometimes we would stop off on a place where we could land and spend up to 4 months at times. I remember a time in South America. I was on land for 4 months. I rented horses. I fell into, by accident, quite adventurous times. I rode with gauchos, camped with Spanish bandits, found myself smack in the middle of revolutions, dodging Indians and whizzing bullets. It's a wonder I'm here. I was a pretty sharp shooter. I was a good shot with a gun, and so I would often shoot game and bring it back for the ship's galley. And as a result, the sailors thought I was all right. They accepted me. Good times. Except for the seasickness. I remember one time finding a fossil specimen of something called a glyptodont. Some of those get to be the size of your, couldn't believe them when I saw them the first time, automobiles. They look a lot like these armadillos that we saw in South America. But these, of course, extinct. And I looked at those fossil specimens, and I looked at the modern-day armadillos, and I thought, they look related. But of course the glyptodonts are not around anymore. They're extinct. Could it be that they are the extinct ancestors of the modern-day armadillos? Could be. Little hints along the way. All through that 5-year journey, I kept careful notes, took careful notes, and collected specimens, all kinds of rocks, fossils, minerals, insects, plants, birds, mammals. We skinned them and cleaned them. I neatly packaged them up in boxes. And along with my letters and notes, whenever we would stop at a port, I would send them off to Professor Henslow, who kept them and shared them with the rest of the scientific community. Do you remember Professor Henslow, my mentor? Do you know who this is? That's not him. That's Charles Lyell, a geologist at the time. Lyell taught me about geology and the forces of geology which have changed the course of rivers, that the forces of geology that have uplifted mountains, the forces of geology that have constructed new continents, that have changed the surface of the earth. And I began to think, if the earth could change, maybe living things could change. Now, I told you about Emma, my wife. She believed that living things were unchanging, that they were still like they were when they were created in the beginning, and there has been no change. Emma's idea is that species are immutable. In fact, that was the common idea at my time, that species are immutable, unchanging. But I kept seeing hints that it just wasn't so. 5-year journey. There was a time in South America when I witnessed an earthquake so devastating it knocked me on my bum. Knocked me down. I couldn't walk. And a volcanic eruption so fierce we feared for our lives. And it reminded me of what Lyle had taught me about the forces of geology. In fact, when we experienced the earthquake, the ground around us raised up 3 feet. 3 feet. Let's go back to here. A group of islands 600 miles west of Ecuador. A group of islands called the Galapagos Islands. 13 major islands. I saw things there that amazed me. Opened my eyes. I felt as if I had been a blind man given sight. Here we are in the Galapagos Islands. That's not the Beagle. That's a ship Mr. Ruhl and his wife sailed on years ago. Oh, the living things there, delightful. Sally Lightfoot crabs. Have you ever seen a Sally Lightfoot crab? In the Galapagos Islands, they're everywhere, on every single island. Delightful creatures. These creatures in the foreground, marine iguanas, not so delightful. Actually kind of hideous, I must say. They get rather large. Look at them. Only a face a mom could love. They're so ugly, as my grandmother would say. They're so homely. They're cute. Do you see it? Look at them posing for Christmas card photograph. Look at them. Strange thing about marine iguanas, the first time I saw them, I could not believe it. They were swimming in the ocean. Iguanas don't swim. But when I got to the Galapagos, I saw iguanas swimming. How could this be? They're different than the iguanas on the South American mainland. Now, I had a hint. I had a clue that the Galapagos Islands were rather new in geologic time. And so any animals and plants that lived there must have come from South America. How they got there, who knows? I have seen chunks of land eroding off of riverbanks and floating out to the ocean. And so possibly they floated on mats or rafts of debris, roots and tree trunks and such things as that. Possibly their ancestors floated that 600-mile trip out to the Galapagos Islands and colonized those islands. And that the things that I saw, the marine iguanas, for example, were the descendants of iguanas that had made that trip across the ocean to the Galapagos Islands. And over time, they had become different from their land-dwelling relatives in South America. Made sense to me. Made sense. Oh, giant tortoises. Goodness sakes. I have to confess, I rode on one. We actually ate giant tortoises. Delicious when cooked properly. Giant tortoises. The sailors would stack them below deck on the ship so that we had meat for the rest of the journey. giant tortoises. Now, I happen to have a giant tortoise shell right here so that you can see it. Oh! Goodness, what is that? Am I being called back to 1870? This is actually a shell from a giant Aldabra tortoise from the Indian Ocean, an island in the Indian Ocean, but it's related to the Galapagos tortoise. Interesting thing about Galapagos tortoises. I've been told, and what did I do? Oh, goodness gracious. I was told by the governor of one of the islands in the Galapagos that he could recognize which island a tortoise came from just based upon the shape of its shell. So here we go again. Tortoises, different kinds of Galapagos tortoises on different islands with different shaped shells, seemingly adapted to life on that particular island. I'll show you what I mean. This is Mr. Ruhl's wife, Gail. I'm told, I'm shedding. This is Mr. Ruhl's wife, Gail, with a giant Galapagos tortoise. On this particular island, there's plenty of rainfall. So lots and lots of grass, vegetation on the ground, and the tortoises on this island lumber along in the ground, eating vegetation off the ground. Those are the dome-shaped shelled tortoises. On the drier islands, I noticed the smaller islands tended to be drier. No vegetation on the ground. The only vegetation available for these tortoises on these dry islands were these prickly pear cactuses that grew to fairly reasonable heights. And so the tortoises on these islands had longer necks, made to stretch up and reach the succulent cactus pads. To do that, they had this arch in the top and the front of their shell. Those were called saddlebacked tortoises. The shape of that shell enabled them to reach up to those succulent cactus plants. See the arch in the shell? So these tortoises on these dry islands seem to be adapted to this particular condition. All those tortoises were obviously related, but very different from one island to the next. Oh, Mr. Ruhl, your teacher needs to get right. Here he is, goofing off again. His childish sense of humor tickles my heart. Thinks he's a tortoise. Here are some other creatures I discovered. I packed these up, sent them back to England. When I got back to England, a good colleague friend of mine examined all these birds. I had originally thought they were wrens and warblers and blackbirds. An anatomist, zoologist friend of mine said, "Oh no, those are not wrens, warblers, and blackbirds. You might be surprised to know they're all finches." I was surprised, but it made me think. On some of the islands we had large ground finches with beaks that were robust, made for chomping down large, hard-to-eat seeds. Medium ground finch, small ground finch, sharp beak, cactus ground finch. These finches on a different island would poke their beak into cactus and get out insects and liquid from the cactus. There were finches that looked like this. I called it a warbler finch. There was a woodpecker finch that used a cactus spine to probe in the cactus and get out insects. Small insect-eating finch, large insect-eating finch, vegetarian finch. They're all different species of finches. It set my mind reeling. I imagined an ancestral species of finches leaving the South American coastland, maybe swept out to the Galapagos by a storm, and then all of these different species evolved from that ancestral species. At first I didn't understand. I just kept collecting clues. There's my mentor again, Professor John Stevens Henslow. When I returned to England, after having sent all of my letters and specimens to him, after he had shared them all with the scientific community in England, he told me when I returned home, Charles, you're famous. The scientific community is excited about your findings and about your work and about your specimens. Ross was overwhelmed, my brother Ross. You know, the reason I was able to pursue my hobby, natural history, my scientific endeavors, was because my father left behind a sizable inheritance for me and my brother. So I had the leisure of being able to be a full-time naturalist scientist. But I became famous. I stepped off that ship, age 27, discovering I had become famous. All the scientists in England wanted to talk to me. As early as 1837, I had this idea that all life on Earth might be related from a common ancestor that branched and split off into different species like twigs branching off of a common tree trunk. But I was afraid to announce that, to publish that, because I knew England in the 1850s was not ready for that. Emma certainly was not ready for that. But it was in my mind. May have explained all these different species of finches having evolved from an ancestral type. At the same time, it must have been about 1838, I read a book entitled On Population by Thomas Robert Malthus. In this book, he painted a very dreary picture of the future of humankind. He said, living things tend to produce excess offspring. Lots and lots of offspring. For example, a fish will lay 200 eggs. Have you ever taken a dandelion that has gone to seed and blown on it and watched the seeds disperse through the air? Hundreds of them from one plant. Living things produce an abundance of offspring. Humans do it, and I noticed that all living things do it. I also noticed something else at the same time. There's variation between members of a species. So I thought about these two things. abundance of offspring, and they don't all survive to adulthood. So there must be a struggle to survive. And at the same time, there's variation between members of a species. No two are exactly alike. Could it be that individuals with certain traits that vary, certain individuals with certain traits that might help them to survive better in a particular environment, that those certain individuals might have a better chance of surviving and passing their genes on to the next generation? I know about genes now because Mr. Ruhl taught me. Back in my time, we didn't know about genes yet. So I wasn't sure how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. Well, about my family. That's me. That's Emma, when we were wed. Isn't she beautiful? I married up. And here is our family. 10 children. Thomas Malthus may have been thinking of us when he said that living things tend to produce abundance of offspring. He may have been thinking of us. Oh, lots of traffic. Malthus was right. These are our 10 children. George Howard, Elizabeth, Charles Waring. Charles died as an infant. That was a dreadful time. Mary Eleanor died as a newborn. A dreadful, dreadful time. Francis, Leonard, Horace, William Erasmus, Henrietta, Annie. 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 I'm sorry. Annie was a child who, when she would walk into a room, the room would light up. Do you know such people? She would always come into my study and sit on my lap and peer into my microscope and ask me what I was up to. Delightful child. At the age of 10, Mr. Ruhl told me we now know it was probably tuberculosis. She got a fever, suffered terribly, and died at the age of 10. I felt like I could not go on. It has hurt me for the rest of my life. So 7 children survived to adulthood, did very well for themselves. There's my sweet Annie. Oh, tourists, go to our house south of London. These ghastly tourists, pesky tourists. This is Down House. That was our Down House. South of London, 15 minutes south of London, in the village of Down. And you can visit there today. That is, if you go inside, you'll find my study. That chair is well worn. You probably don't know this, but for all of my adult life, I suffered with excruciating stomach pains. There were days when I would vomit all day, and I wouldn't be able to work. You might notice, if you look closely in my study, there's a barricade here, and behind there, my own private privy. I was sick a lot. It may have been a bug that I caught in South America that stayed with me forever. I don't know. Close-up of my desk, where I eventually wrote On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. This is the drawing room. In the evening, I would recline on this couch. Emma would play the piano right back here. She would play the piano, and I would close my eyes and relax in the evening. I'm told that today you have television, and that's what you do? This is a path around the property, the sand walk, the thinking walk. I spent many hours just strolling along this path, thinking, contemplating, trying to piece together what all of my notes meant, trying to work out how it is that new species form from ancestral species. About this time, I was also breeding pigeons as a hobby. These are various kinds of fancy breeds of pigeons. Have you ever seen these? Fancy breeds? All descended from the common rock dove. All these various breeds. I want to find out what you know. How have all of these different breeds of pigeons been produced? By what process?
Sexual reproduction.
Pardon?
Sexual reproduction.
Most definitely, sexual reproduction. And how have, over many generations, how have fancy breeds like this one evolved from the common rock dove? How did that happen?
You, or whoever, bred them together so that certain traits would appear repetitively. So
Exactly. Exactly. Selective breeding, or we call it artificial selection. Artificial selection. And the same process has allowed plant breeders to create from an ancestral species all these different varieties of vegetables. Kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, broccoli, kale. Don't care much for kale. All derived from this common ancestor by artificial selection. And I thought, if humans could create all these varieties by artificial selection, what might nature be able to do over millions of years of natural selection? Maybe it is, maybe it could be then, that as a result, all life on earth is related to a common ancestor that lived in the distant past. I call this descent with modification. You call it evolution. Actually, more accurately, descent with modification would be a good definition for evolution. This is my good friend, Dr. Joseph Dalton Hooker, director of the Royal Botanical Gardens, a botanist, good friend of mine. He'll come into the picture later, but he was one of the first people who I admitted to when I finally hit upon my idea of evolution by natural selection. I wrote to him, I'm almost convinced that species are not, it's like confessing a murder, immutable. In other words, species change. They're not unchanged and static as the Creator originally made them, but they've been changing through the eons. The reason I said it's like confessing a murder is because I knew it was a dangerous thing to confess and to publish, because I didn't know if England was ready. Then it happened. Does anyone know who this old dead person is? Now you know. Alfred Russel Wallace. He sent me a letter with a paper that he had written. He had discovered independently the theory of evolution by natural selection. I was shocked. He was about to announce to the world what I had been working on for 20 years. My brother Lass said to me, Charles, you must publish so that you can gain your priority, so that you will be given credit for this discovery. You must publish. And my friends as well, Charles Lyell, Joseph Hooker, they read Wallace's paper, they read my notes and paper, and they said, Charles, you must publish your paper. You must present a paper with Alfred Russel Wallace at the next Academy meetings, and the two of you together should present your findings to the world, your discovery of natural selection. And we did. And do you know, Alfred Russel Wallace is one of the most gentlemanly gentlemen I know. Do you know what he said in so many words? He said, Sir Charles Darwin, you have been working on this for 20 years. I've just now stumbled upon the idea, after my adventures in Asia, I'm just now stumbling on the idea, and I really think, Charles, you deserve the credit. That's why they make bobbleheads of me now. You deserve the credit, Charles. So we both presented our papers at the same time. I went to work then, straight away, writing. It was difficult because it was during that time period that one of our infant children died, laid me low, didn't want to work, but somehow I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and did it. And I wrote, and I walked on the sand path, the sand walk, and I thought, and I wrote, and I thought, and I wrote, and I threw up because of that dreadful stomach ailment that affected me my entire life.
Do you know what year you wrote this?
1859. Good question, my young man. November 24th, 1859, it was published. This is one of the first printings. 1859. Mr. Ruhl has told me, he said, Charles, modern biology began November 24th, 1859. And he said, Charles, you may be surprised to know this. Your theory of evolution by natural selection is the central organizing theory of the biological sciences. I was shocked. Couldn't have been that major. Seems fairly simple. Look at it. Look at it. It's fairly simple. And so you're probably asking, then why a big, thick book? Well, I had to present lots of evidence. The concept is fairly simple. I think you should write this down on your paper. Number one, there's a struggle for existence. Remember Malthus? Living things produce more offspring than can survive. There's a struggle. Only a few survive. Number two, variation and adaptation. There is variation in nature. No two are the same. Mr. Ruhl tells me you'll be doing other activities where you'll learn these things. So if you don't get them all written down today, no worries. Variation, no two alike. Look at this picture. If you were a grasshopper in this picture, which color would you rather be? Yellow? Green? Blend in with the grass. Along comes a bird that likes to eat grasshoppers, picking off the easy-to-see yellow ones. Which ones have the advantage? Who or what in this environment is doing the selecting? The bird, something in nature. Natural selection is deciding which individuals with which traits will survive and reproduce and pass their genes to the next generation. Green grasshoppers over time become more common because of that advantageous trait. So you see, it's not individuals that evolve, it's populations that evolve. Whole populations evolve. That's basically the idea of natural selection. Now, of course, they're still grasshoppers. They haven't changed into anything else because it's just been a small time period. Sometime you should read my book. This is the only drawing I had in my book. It shows the ancestral species with all these species branching off, species splitting into 2 or 3 more new species. Evolution driven by the process of natural selection. Oh, I also did lots of experiments with barnacles. 8 years worth. But you probably don't want to hear about that. Are you getting tired? Just a tad. Mr. Ruhl told me, remember, when I go back to 1870, I won't remember any of this. Mr. Ruhl told me that I was so respected in England, in the scientific community especially, that they buried me in Westminster Abbey. I thought, no, that can't be. They bury kings and queens in Westminster Abbey. They bury poets and artists. Mr. Ruhl said, I'm glad, Charles, you won't remember this when you go back home. No one wants to know the day they die. But he tells me that that's where I'm buried. And there's the slab over my tomb in Westminster Abbey. Died April 19th, 1882. What's today? April 19th. Mr. Ruhl told me he didn't even realize that when he invited me to speak to you today. Isn't that weird? So there I am, under there. What an honor. He said I'm buried close to Sir Isaac Newton, of all people, and Charles Dickens, of all people. I don't deserve it. I'm just a naturalist who loves to study nature, who takes careful notes, who loves his children and his wife. But the world thinks I'm famous. Somewhat humbling. Somewhat humbling. Before I depart, and we go our separate ways, I feel the need to read the last sentence of my book, Origin of Species. The last sentence. This is how I ended this big book. The last sentence. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. It's been a pleasure. I wish you much success with your studies. My cane. Where did I put my cane. There are times when the arthritis acts up and, I need the cane. Anywho, I wish you much success with your studies and a good life. I'm going back to 1870. Cheers.